curiosity of the historian himself. The record sequence in Africa is drawn from all kinds of science, exact, natural, human and social. The message of history is now completely transformed in the sense that the methodology consists in using several specific sources and techniques simultaneously and in combination. Data furnished by oral tradition, the rare Arabic and the NU scripts, archaeological excavations and the carbon-14 dating method have finally restored the legendary Sao people of Chad, Cameroon and Nigeria to the authenticated history of Africa. The Moundat and data, in the Republic of Chad, is known to have had a history of occupation lasting nearly 2,500 years, from the 5th century before our era to the middle of our 19th century, but such opposite and unexpected conclusions would never have been arrived at without a combined and simultaneous use of a variety of sources. The classical notions of historical criticism, which speak of auxiliary sciences, choice of sources, prime historical material, and so on, are henceforth banished from African historical research, and this marks an important step forward in contemporary historiography. The work of a historian of Africa was becoming a continuous interdisciplinary dialogue. New horizons are opening up, thanks to an unprecedented theoretical effort. The idea of combined sources has, as it were, unearthed from the subsoil of general methodology a new way of writing history. The compilation and exposition of the history of Africa may therefore play an exemplary pioneer role in associating other branches of learning with historical research. 85 pounds F***. Plate 4. IBAS relief from Abomey Museum Photo Nubia. 86. Written sources before the 15th century. DJAIP. The notion of written source is so broad as to be ambiguous. If we take written to mean all that transmits the voice and sound, then written evidence includes inscriptions carved on stone, gramophone records, coins, in short any message that preserves language and thought, regardless of its medium. One such an extension would mean that this chapter should cover numismatics, epigraphy and other auxiliary studies which have, strictly speaking, become independent of the sphere of the written text. I shall therefore restrict them by investigation to what is drawn or printed in conventional signs on any kind of support, papyrus, parchment, bone, paper. This still leaves a vast field for research and reflection, first because chronologically it covers a period that begins with the invention of writing and ends on the threshold of modern times 15th century, next because spatially it covers an entire continent, with different civilizations juxtaposed and in succession, and lastly because it includes sources that vary in language, cultural tradition and type. I am going to consider the general problems that are raised by these sources, analysis by period, by region, by type before making a critical inventory. General problems and a comprehensive study of the written sources of African history is so far been made. Because of chronological or regional specialization, the rare studies made have always been associated with compartmentalized fields of scholarly research. Thus Pharaonic Egypt is the field of the Egyptologist, Ptolemaic and Romban Egypt of the classicist, Muslim Egypt of the Islamist. 3 periods, 3 specialties, only the first of which stems from what is specifically Egyptian, the other two moving in wider orbits the classical world. Islam. The same holds true for the Maghreb, though the Punic scholar is both an Orientalist and classicist and the Berber specialist marginal and unclassifiable. I.A. Dane, 1961, page 449. Methodology and African Prehistory. Black Africa made a later appearance both in written history and as a field for modern research. It is varied in itself and study of it cuts across different languages and specialties. There are classical, Arabic and vernacular language sources. These are the same trio we find to the north of the Sahara, but to the south they have neither the same scope nor a similar meaning. There is a huge area where until the 15th century the written source is non-existent, and what is a second-rate Arabic source for, say, the Rib, takes on prime importance for the Niger Basin. The historian of Black Africa studying a document written in Arabic does not approach it like the historian of the Maghreb, and still less like the historian of Islam as a whole. These compartments and these interferences represent the objective structure of African history, but also the orientation of modern historical studies since the 19th century. It is a fact that Egypt was integrated into the Hellenistic world, into the Roman Empire, into Byzantium, and that, once converted to Islam, it became a radiant point in the Islamic world. It is a fact that the classical writers saw Historia Africana as an illustration of Historia Romana, and that one particular Africa was indeed deeply involved in the destiny of Roman civilization. But it is quite as true that even the modern historian of Rome and Africa is a Romanist first and an Africanist second, and that the Islamic aspect is out of his epistemological field. To apprehend African history as a whole and look at its written sources as relating to that whole is therefore a delicate and singularly difficult task. The problem of periodization. What is the justification for placing the Sigurd at the beginning of the 15th century in the study of written sources? Is it that until the 15th century the massive documentation available to us has a certain inner structural unity, whatever the cultural and temporal disparities? Or is it that the development of general history now tends to run antiquity and the Middle Ages together into one single long stretch of time, cutting them off from a modern age that seems sharply different from anything that went before? The truth is that these two arguments support and supplement each other. The characteristic ancient and medieval sources are literary writings. The evidence they give is for the most part conscious, whether they be annals, chronicles, travels or geographies, whereas from the 15th century on archival sources, unconscious evidence, become abundant. For another thing, while until the 15th century classical and Arabic sources predominate, after that even our Arabic sources peter out, and we suddenly find evidence from a different provenance, the European document Italian, Portuguese, etc. and, for Black Africa, the autochthonous document. But this shift in the nature and provenance of sources also represents a change in Africa's real historical destiny. The 88. Written sources before the 15th century. 15th century was the time of European expansion. The Portuguese made their eruption on the coast of Black Africa in 1434, and 20 years before 1415 they had settled at Ceuta. 3. For the Mediterranean and Islamic fringe of Africa, the Maghreb, Egypt. The cleavage between two historic eras appears as early as the 14th century, when that world was already feeling the effects of the slow expansion of the West and also, doubtless, of internal forces of decay. But the 15th century was decisive, because then the Far Eastern sources of Muslim trade ran out, putting an end to its intercontinental role. From that time on, Mediterranean African Islam entered upon a steadily rapid decline. A terminus adiquorn in the 15th century is fully justified, then, if we do not interpret it too rigidly, but perhaps there would be even greater justification for moving it on to the early 16th century. That said, the era we are studying may be broken down into three main periods, in view of the twofold necessity for diversity and unity. A. Antiquity, up to Islam, from the Old Kingdom to 622 of our era. B. The First Islamic Age, from 622 of our era to the middle of the 11th century 1050. C. The Second Islamic Age, from the 11th to the 15th century. Here, of course, the notion of antiquity is not the same as obtains in Western history, in as much as it is only partly to be identified with classical antiquity. In Africa, antiquity ends not with the barbarian invasions but with the abrupt appearance of Islam. But by the very depth and scope of its impact, Islam represents a rupture with a past that might be called ancient, or prehistoric, or protohistoric, according to region. There is also the fact that from the Hellenistic era most of our ancient sources are in Greek and Latin. Both because of the structure of our documentation and because of the general course of history, the 7th century, when Islam and Arabic sources appeared, must be regarded as the beginning of the New Age. But this new Islamic period should be divided, with a first subperiod stretching from the conquest to the mid-11th century and a second from the 11th century to the 15th. In the history of Africa north of the Sahara, the first phase corresponds to the organization of the area the Islamic model and its attachment to a multi-continental empire Umayyad, Abbasid, Fatimid caliphates. The second phase by contrast sees the resurgence of autochthonous principles of organization, while civilization is profoundly transformed. For the Maghreb, the mid-11th century was the time of the formation of the Almoravid Empire and the reconquest of autonomy by the Zirids, with its corollary, the Hilali invasion. In Egypt, the political 2. Mani 1965, page 178 proposes 1434 as the date of Portuguese maritime expansion towards Black Africa. See also R. Mani, 1961, page 18. 3. 8. La Ruiz, 1970, page 218. 89. Methodology and African Prehistory. Seizure comes a century later, with the Iwigs, but it is now that the great centers of trade activity moved from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea and that a worldwide pattern of trade is gradually established, the effects of which are very important. South of the Sahara, it is likewise in the course of the 11th century that permanent relations are established with Islam, particularly in the sphere of commerce and religion. The nature of our documentary material changes. Quantitatively it becomes plentiful and varied. Qualitatively, as time passes, we find more and more unconscious sources, documentary records, legal consultations for Mediterranean Africa, and more accurate information for Black Africa. Ethno-cultural areas and types of sources. Classifying sources by historical periods is not enough in itself. We have to consider both Africa's articulation into ethno-cultural zones characterized by a variety of forces and, above and beyond historical periods and spatial differences, the actual typology of the sources available to us. Ethno-cultural areas. To begin with the first point, it is rather tempting to make an elementary distinction at the very outset between Africa north of the Sahara, white, Arabic, Islamic Africa, touched to its depths by the Mediterranean civilizations, and by that token distorted from its African origins, and Africa south of the Sahara, black, African to the utmost, endowed with an indomitable ethno-historical specificity. In reality, without denying the importance of such specific qualities, the more searching historical examination shows lines of cleavage that are more complex and less sharp. For example, the Senegalese and Nigerian Sudan has lived in symbiosis with the Arab Berber Maghreb, and from the point of view of sources it is much closer to the Maghreb than to the Bantu world. It is the same for the Nilotic Sudan in relation to Egypt and for the Horn of Africa in relation to southern Arabia. Therefore one is tempted to oppose an Africa of the Mediterranean, the desert and the savanna, embracing the Maghreb, Egypt, the two Sudans, Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa and the east coast as far as Zanzibar, to another Africa, animistic, deep, tropical and equatorial, the Zaire Basin, the Guinea coast, the Zambezi-Limpopo area, the interlacustran region, and finally southern Africa. And it is true that this second differentiation is in large measure justified by the criterion of exposure to the outside world and the degree of Islamic penetration. This fact of civilization is corroborated by the state of our written sources, where we find an ample supply, with north-south gradations, for one Africa and an 90 written sources before the 15th century. Absolute void for another Africa, at least during the period we are studying. But with this dual consideration, accessibility to the outside world, and the state of the written sources, there is the risk that value judgments may come in and cast a veil of obscurity over almost half the continent, Central and Southern Africa. The number of historians have already drawn attention to the danger of resort to Arabic sources which by their emphasis on the Sudanese zone might create the impression that it was the only center of an organized civilization and state. For I shall come back to this point later. But even here let us recognize that while there is a connection between the state of a civilization and the state of the available sources, we cannot explain the actual course of history simply by that connection. An objective historian has no right to make value judgments on the basis of his documentary material. But neither has he the right to neglect what it has to offer on the grounds that it might possibly be misleading. While a general history covering the entire historical era and using the whole mass of available documentation we accord as much importance to the Zaire Basin as to the Niger Basin or to Egypt, a study confined to pre-15th century written sources cannot. With due allowance for all that has been said above, we can now suggest the following regional divisions: A. Egypt, Cyrenaica, Nilotic Sudan. B. The Maghreb, including the northern fringe of the Sahara, the zones of the farthest west, Tripolitania and Fezzan. C. The Western Sudan in the broad sense, that is, extending to Lake Chad to the east and including the southern Sahara. D. Ethiopia, Eritrea, the Horn and the east coast. The rest of the continent, viz. the Gulf of Guinea, Central Africa, Southern Africa. This classification has the advantage of not setting up two opposing Africas, It divides the continent according to African geographical historical affinities but also pays due heed to the particular nature of the available written sources. In terms of written sources, Central and Southern Africa, rich in civilization as it might, cuts a very poor figure by comparison with the tiniest fraction of the other regional units Fezzan or Eritrea, for example. For another thing, there can be no doubt that in addition to the general solidarity characterizing the sources for known Africa, there is a specific, clearer solidarity in our sources of information for each particular one of the zones delimited above. To make a detailed inventory, therefore, we must review our texts by period and by region, but we must recognize at the outset that through the regions, and to a lesser degree through the historical periods, what we have comes DOWM to sources in a few languages only, of certain limited types, and that they do not always originate in the area they treat of and are not always contemporary with what they describe. For IHRBEC, 1965, Volume V, page 311. CI. Methodology and African Prehistory. Typology of written sources. The languages in which our documents have come down to us are many, but they do not all have the same importance. The African languages most used, the ones conveying the greatest mass of information, are Ancient Egyptian, Berber, Ethiopian languages. The most prolific languages are those of non-African origin, Greek, Latin, Arabic. Even if Arabic has been accepted as a national language by a number of African peoples. If we classify our documents in a pyramid that takes both quantity and quality of information into account, we get roughly the following order: Arabic, Greek, Latin, Ancient Egyptian, Hieratic and Demotic, Coptic, Hebrew, Aramaic, Ethiopian, Italian, Persian, Chinese and some languages of lesser importance. Chronologically, our first written sources are hieratic Egyptian papyri dating from the NEW Kingdom but giving texts that were probably first written as far back as the early Middle Kingdom, beginning of the second millennium, in particular the papyrus known as Instructions for King Merikra. 5. Then we have NEW Kingdom papyri and ostraka, still in hieratic Egyptian, Greek sources going back to the 7th century before our era and continuing without a break to a late period roughly coinciding with the expansion of Islam. About 700 of our era sources in Hebrew. The Bible and Aramaic Elephantine Jews dating from the 26th dynasty, Demotic Egyptian texts dating from the Ptolemaic period, Latin literature, Coptic literature in Coptic script, using the Egyptian language but the Greek alphabet with a few additional letters beginning in about 300 of our era, Arabic, Chinese, 6 possibly, Persian, Italian, and, later, Ethiopian, the oldest writing in which is of the 13th century. 7. Generically, the material we have can be divided into narrative sources and archival sources, the ones deliberately written down so as to leave a record, the others part of the ordinary course of human existence. For Africa, excepting Egypt but including the Maghreb, written documentary material is almost entirely represented by narrative sources until the 12th century. These therefore cover both antiquity and the First Islamic Age. From the 12th century the archival document makes its appearance, rarely, however, in the Maghreb Almahad items, fatwas or legal consultations of the Hafsid era. In Egypt archival documents become more plentiful under the Ayyubids and the Mamluks 12th to 15th centuries, while the manuscripts of Ethiopian monasteries contain official documents by way of appendices. But for the rest of Africa this type of text. 5. C. Briaton and J. Bangier, 1962, page 226. 6. There exists one Chinese text from the latter half of the 11th century, but mainly the Chinese sources, which are yet to be explored, concern the 15th century and the East African coast. The following works may also be mentioned: J.J.L. Wendock, 1949, F. Hirth, 1909-10, T. Fileside, 1962, L. Libra, 1963, P. Wheatley, 1964. 7. S. Habil Selassie, 1967, page 13. 02. Written sources before the 15th century. Remains virtually non-existent during the whole period under consideration. 8. The features marking this period are a continuing preponderance of narrative sources, the appearance of the relative increase of archival sources from the 12th century in Mediterranean Africa and the virtual lack of them in Black Africa, but generally speaking a substantial increase in documentary material from about 1000 till it reaches a peak in the 12th to 14th centuries. Our types of sources can be enumerated as follows. Narrative sources: chronicles and annals, geographical works, accounts of travels, works by naturalists, legal works, religious works, treatises on canon law, devotional books or lives of saints, literary works in the strict sense. Archival sources: private documents, family letters, business correspondence, etc. Official documents emanating from the state or representatives of the state, official correspondence, decrees, letters patent, legislative and fiscal texts, juridical religious documents. I might point out that the narrative sources begin in the 8th century before our era, with Homer, and include many masterworks of the human intellect and learning. There are great names among the authors, even if most of them do not treat of Africa in particular but give it a more or less important place against a broader background. The among them are Herodotus, Polybius, Pliny the Elder, Ptolemy, Procopius, Khwarizmi, Masudi, Yahya, Ibn Khaldun. The archival documentation for Africa is the oldest in the world, whereas the Ravenna papyri, the oldest archival records preserved in Europe, date from the early 6th century of our era. The papyri of the Egyptian and EW kingdom go back 20 centuries before that. It is true that this type of evidence did not extend beyond the boundaries of Egypt in the First Islamic Age and did not extend very much farther even by the end of our period, probably because of the fact that medieval Islamic civilization was to all intents and purposes ignorant of the principle of preserving state documents. In the 14th and 15th centuries, when archival items are in greatest profusion, it is mostly through encyclopedic works that they are transmitted to us. We have to wait for the modern era, Ottoman and European, for regular repositories of archives to be constituted. 8. We have drums, letters patent issued by the kings of Bornu probably dating from the late 11th century, that of Jilmi and that of the Masbrama family. On this subject cr. Mani, 1961. 93. Methodology and African Prehistory. Inventory. The Y period pre-Islamic antiquity from the beginnings to 622 of our era. What characterizes this period by comparison with the one that follows is the predominance of archaeological and, more broadly, non-literary sources. But even if they are secondary written documents, they do occasionally provide us with very important information. Moreover, they become more copious and more accurate with the passage of time. From the point of view of zonal distribution, it should be noted that there is a total blank for West and Central Africa. Egypt, Nubia, East Africa. Until the first millennium of our era, written sources for Egypt are exclusively Egyptian. They are hieratic papyri and ostraka which do not go back beyond the NEW kingdom in physical form but make, as I have said, record information that is more ancient. 9. Papyrus and ostracan designate the kind of support. The one is a plant, the other a flake of limestone. Hieratic signs differ from hieroglyphic signs in their cursive appearance. They were for drawing on a surface rather than carving. Papyri and ostraka, numerous for the 19th and 20th dynasties of the NEW kingdom, or the Ramesside period 1314 to 1085 before our era, bear on governmental and private life alike. We find civil service and legal reports, accountancy records, private letters, and also stories and novels. The legal 10 and literary 1 papyri have been studied carefully and, from the 19th century on, have been published. Unless new discoveries should be made, we can learn nothing of Nubia and the country of Punt from written sources, but must depend on archaeological and epigraphic material, Rafiki in particular. In the first millennium before our era, especially from the 6th century on, there is a diversification and a rearrangement in what our sources have to give. Narrative documents unite with archival ones and at certain moments take their place. Thus the Book of Kings, a fragment of the 9. E. Drayton and J. Bangier, 1962, pages 7-9, J. Yacht, 1956. 10. Among legal documents we have the Aber Papyrus, the Amherst and Mayer Papyri, and the Turin Papyrus, which are the foundation for what we know of the reigns of Ramesses I X, X and XI. They have been published, cf. Select papyri in the hieratic character from the collections of the British Museum, London, I 860 p. E. Newberry, 1899, Pete, 1920, 1930. 11. The British Museum collection is rich in literary papyri. It includes, for example, the Tale of Truth and Falsehood and the Tale of Horus and Seth. Posiner, the great specialist in this subject, made a quasi-exhaustive list of Egyptian literary works and arrived at 58 titles. Posiner, 1951. He also published some Ostraka. Posiner, 1934. 94. Written sources before the 15th century. Old Testament gives us valuable information about the advent of the 22nd dynasty c. 950 before our era and remains very useful for the whole of the following period, that is, to the Persian domination 525 before our era. The Book of Kings was first written before the destruction of Jerusalem, i.e. before 586, 12 and was reworked during the exile, but it reproduces traditions that go back to the beginning of the first millennium before our era. Other foreign sources, namely Greek, shed light on the late period from the 1st Set dynasty 7th century Menander, Aristodemus, Philocatus, Herodotus. From the archival point of view, papyri are now written in Greek or in Demotic Egyptian, a script even more cursive than the Hieratic. In the 5th century the papyri of the Elephantine Jews provide our principal source material, whereas for the 4th and 3rd centuries we have the Demotic Chronicle. See the 1,000 years from the establishment of the Ptolemies in Egypt late 4th century before our era to the Arab conquest 639 of our era form a period which is distinguished by the importance, quantitatively, of Greek sources and by the Ethiopo-Eritrean zone coming within our ken. Polybius, Strabo, Diodorus and Pliny the Elder speak of this region with a relative accuracy that does not preclude ignorance or naivete. In his Natural History the Roman naturalist gives us a great deal of information about the Ethiopian world, especially as regards trade routes and merchandise. It is a compilation of unequal value, certainly, but splendid for various details. Our information becomes more accurate in the 500 years that followed the appearance of Christianity. Egypt, as is well known, became the chief seat of Hellenistic culture in the 2nd century, and it is quite natural that the country should have produced historians, geographers, philosophers and fathers of the Church. Politically integrated first into the Roman, then into the Byzantine Empire, Egypt was a topic in many foreign Latin and Greek writings, both narrative and archival. For instance, the Theodosian Code or Justinian's Novely. We may note too that the papyrus tradition was not discontinued. In this mass of documentation, domestic and foreign, a few works of uncommon importance stand out. Ptolemy's Geography 13 c. 140 of our era, the Periplues of the Erythraean Sea, 14, an anonymous work once assigned to the 1st century, now reckoned to have been composed around 230, and the Topographica Christiana 15 of Cosmas Indicopleus c. 535. These writings form the basis of our information on Ethiopia and the Horn. 12. Logs, 1950, page 7, Bedriaton and J. Bangier, 1962/Asira, J. Dores, 1971, volume I, pages 47-61. 13. For classical and post-classical geographers who dealt with Africa, see the standard work by Y. Fonte, 1926-51. The reissue of this work, augmented by a new and substantial critical apparatus, would be most welcome. 14. Edited by Mell, 1853, volume I, and again by John H. Marfrisk, 1927. There had been editions of this important work as early as the 16th century 1533 and 1577. 95. Methodology and African Prehistory of Africa. But on the whole this brief summary shows up to imbalances. Imbalance of written sources with respect to other types of documents and of our knowledge of Egypt with respect to our knowledge of Nubia and the Eritrean world. Ancient Maghreb. The written history of the ancient Maghreb grew out of the collision between Carthage and Rome. It follows that we have nothing important before the 2nd century before our era. Some scattered clues in Herodotus, of course, and also in the works of other Greek historians. For the authentically Punic period we depend on archaeology and epigraphy. Moreover, the written sources for the history of Carthage not only before Hannibal but also during its confrontation with Rome, and during its temporary survival thereafter, are almost never Punic. It is now established that the Periplues of Hanno, which is in Greek, which describes territory up to the northwest coast of Africa, is spurious and cannot have been written earlier than the 1st century before our era. This leaves us with the agronomically work ascribed to Mago, of which we have only extracts preserved by Latin authors. But among autochthonous sources mention should be made of the notices of Juba II which Pliny the Elder included in his natural history. Most if not all of our written sources for the history of the ancient Maghreb, Carthaginian, Roman, Vandal and Byzantine phases, consist of works by classical historians and geographers, that is, historians and geographers writing in Greek or Latin. Generally speaking, these authors were foreign to Africa, but as Africa became Romanized, autochthonous writers sprang up, particularly among the Church Fathers. 8 in the period extending from 200 before our era to 100 of our era, which covers the zenith and the fall of Carthage and the organization of the Roman province of Africa under the Republic and the Principate, we have a multitude of well-known Greek and Latin writings as sources. Polybius 200-120 is our chief source, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, Sallust 87-35 Livy, Appian, Pliny, Tacitus, Plutarch 1st century of our era and Ptolemy 2nd century of our era, not to speak of the many minor authors. 16. 15. Cosmas was a traveler who visited Ethiopia and the island of Socotra. His work appears in volume XXXVIII of Mibni's Patrologia Graeca, a book which absolutely must be consulted for antiquity, along with the same editor's Patrologia Latina. An excellent edition of Cosmas' works, in 3 volumes, has been published by Editions du Cerf, Paris, 1968-70. For a work which makes an important contribution to our knowledge of the Christianization of Ethiopia, see Rufinus, Historia Ecclesiastica, in Mibni's Patrologia Graeca, which always gives a Latin translation. 16. I might mention Aristotle Politics, Caesar Bellum Civil and Bellum Africum Utopius, Justinian, Barocius. There are more than 30 textual sources for the story of Hannibal alone. 96. Written sources before the 15th century. It would be most helpful if the scattered writings on North Africa were collected. This has been done only for Morocco. 17. At present the student has to go systematically through the great collections of the Class 6. Those collections in which 19th century European erudition put forth all it had by way of criticism and formidable labor, the Bibliotheca Tugmeriana, the Loeb Classical Library text with English translation, the collection G. The text with French translation, the collection de Universités de France, the Scriptorum Classicorum Bibliothecae Oxonienses. These narrative sources should be added, the more direct sources constituted by texts of Roman law, even though these are of epigraphic origin. 18. The writings of the Greco-Latin annalists, chroniclers and geographers are not of uniform value for this whole subperiod. While some of the authors tend merely to compile information provided by their predecessors, others bring us precious original information and occasionally even first-hand testimony. For instance, Polybius was an intimate of the Scythios and seems to have been present at the siege of Carthage in 146 before our era. Sallust's Bellum Tuberfinum is a document of the highest order for the Berber kingdoms. Caesar's Bellum Civil is the work of an actor in history. The personality and the work of Polybius dominate this period. Polybius has been called the son of the Hellenistic age 9 and culture. He was born around 200 before our era, that is, at the moment when Rome, on the flood tide of its imperialism, encountered the Mediterranean world and more especially the Hellenistic East. A prisoner and an exile at Rome, he learned the hard lessons of exile, that violent teacher of historian and philosopher. The Scythios' protection made his sojourn easier and above all gave him the chance to learn a great deal about Roman and Carthaginian history. After 16 years' captivity he returned to his homeland, Greece, but promptly set off again to travel about the world. We are told that during his stay in Africa he was offered a fleet of ships by Scipio Aemilianus so that he could explore the Atlantic coast of the continent. In other words, here was a man of audacity, experience and tireless curiosity. Polybius is not merely our chief source for everything that touches on the Punico-Roman duel, he is, in a more general way, the first-class observer of the Africa and Egypt of his day. If only the 40 books that made up the Pragmatil had been left to us, we should doubtless know a great deal more than we do. Possibly we might even have been given information of an accuracy lacking everywhere else on Black Africa. But even as it is, The 6 books that have come down to us tower over our other sources because of the quality of the information and the intelligent perspective. After the 1st century, and throughout the 4 centuries during 17. M. Roget, 1924. 18. P. F. Erard, 1937. 19. T. R. Glover, 1977, Chapter I, page 1. 97. Methodology and African Prehistory, which are an imperial organization took its deepest root in Africa and then entered into a prolonged state of crisis. Literary sources are few and far between. There is practically a total void in the 2nd century, and the 3rd and 4th are marked by the preponderance of Christian writings, notably Cyprian's and Augustine's. There are general works that transcend the African frame of reference to pose great religious problems and have no element of direct historical discourse, but there are also polemical and occasional works with a more immediate interest in current events. For instance, our knowledge of the Donatist movement is based on attacks made by its greatest adversary, Saint Augustine 354–430, and for that very reason we have to tread with extreme caution. In fact, as far as written sources for the imperial period are concerned, the Patrologia is our main instrument of knowledge, but a very partial one. Here, too, the student has to turn to great collections such as the Berlin corpus in Greek and the Vienna corpus in Latin. These monuments of German erudition have their French counterpart in these 2 collections, the Patrologia Graeca Greek text and Latin translation and the Patrologia Latin text only. The Vandal interlude, the Byzantine reconquest and the Byzantine presence for over a century led more writers to record events. Minor works abound and archival sources, correspondence, legislative texts make their appearance. Above all, we are fortunate in having one prolific and talented observer in Procopius' 6th century whose De Bello Evangelico is by far our most fundamental source. For Greek texts, we can use the Bonn Byzantine collection and, secondarily, the Fragmentary Historicorum Recordum. The numerous Latin texts can be found either in the Patrologia Latin of the works of Saint Fulgentius have a certain interest for the Vandal period or in a monument of Germany Historica, Octors Antiquissimi, 20, another impressive product of German learning, which brings together the minor chronicles of the Byzantine age, Cassiodorus, Prosper Tiro, Hyatius, and above all Victor Vitensis and Corpus. These last 2 authors are the most noteworthy, Victor for the Vandal period and Corpus for the Byzantine, because they penetrate into the interior of Africa and throw the light on that darkest Africa, so long in oblivion. Charles Deal, in his classic work on Byzantine Africa, showed how one can use archaeological and textual material conjointly so as to get as close as possible to historical reality. The range of written sources he used was as wide as could be, first of all Procopius, with Corpus, but 20. In MOMMSCNS Monumenta, Volume 9/1 to 2 1892 11 1894 and 13 1898. The text by Victor Vitensis is found in Volume 3 to 1 1879 edited by C. Holm, and the text by Corpus is found in Volume 3 to 2 1879 edited by J. Partsch. 21. For Vandal and Byzantine Africa we have 2 standard modern works that give details of the usable sources, c. Courtois, 1955, and c. Deal, 1959. Escoselles, Paris, 1920-8. Though out of date, is still worth consulting. 98. Written sources before the 15th century. Also Agathias, Cassiodorus, Georgius Cyprius, 22. The letters of Pope Gregory the Great, and legal documents like the Nobly and the Justinian Code, so helpful for investigation of economic and social life. It does not seem likely that our established list of written documents can be enriched by any new discoveries. On the other hand, we can better exploit the documents we do have by studying them more intensively, by applying rigorous criticism, by collating them with archaeological and epigraphic material which is not yet exhausted, and above all by using them with greater honesty and objectivity. 23. Sub-Saharan and Western Africa. Strictly speaking, we have no trustworthy documentation on Western Black Africa. If we accept with MDU-NY24 that the ancients, Carthaginians, Greeks, Romans, did not go beyond Cape Uge and the latitude of the Canaries, as is more than probable, then the information in their writings relates to the extreme southern part of Morocco. They are certainly on the edge of the Black World, but they do not penetrate it. The Periplus of Hanno is largely if not entirely spurious. 25. It is a composite work with jumbled or wings from Herodotus, Polybius, Poseidonus, and the Pseudo-Silax, and must date from the 1st century before our era. More serious are the original writings of those same authors. Herodotus reports on the silent trade the Carthaginians carried on in southern Morocco. The continuer of the Pseudo-Silax 4th century before our era in his turn gives valuable information about their relations with the Libyan Berbers. But above all, Polybius turns out, once again, to be the most accurate source. The snippets of his text interpolated in Pliny the Elder give us the first identifiable place names of ancient times. But his information, too, stops at Cape Ugae. It has to be supplemented, for the Canaries archipelago, by the notices of Juba II collected by Pliny, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus and the other historian geographers of the 1st centuries before and during our era merely compiled previous authors, save for a few details. Finally, in the 2nd century, Ptolemy, resuming all his predecessors, with special reliance on Poseidonus and Marius of Tyre, recorded in his geography the most thoroughgoing knowledge antiquity possessed of the contours of Africa. 26. In the Empire in Libya he also left us. This Alexandrian geographer was able to draw on information the Roman army had obtained in the course of punitive expeditions beyond the Lightens into the Fezzan, the expedition of Balbus in 19 before our era, that of 22. Descriptio Orbis Romani, edited by H. Gelser, 1890. 23. Distortion caused by a partial reading of texts. 8. La Rui's criticism of Western historiography is as pertinent as it is well informed. 24. Armani, 1970b, pages 87 to 111. 25. Hibbett, page 98, H. Tauxier, 1882, pages 15 to 37, G. Germain, 1957, pages 205 to 48. 26. Y. Fondal, Monumento, Opus Cit, Volume II, F.A.s. I, pages N6ff, Armani, 1947. 99. Methodology and African Prehistory. Flaccus in 70 of our era, that of Maternus in 86, the one which pushed deepest into the Libyan desert. 27. Some names of peoples and regions have survived antiquity: Mauritania, Lydia, Garamantes, the Etruali, Numidians, Hesperides, even Niger, the name advanced by Ptolemy and taken up by the old Africanus and later on by modern Europeans. This is one thing contributed by our texts which otherwise give us rather the image antiquity had of Africa than any real data. The few data that do crop up here and there concern the Libyan desert and the coast of the Western Sahara. Western Black Africa remains peripheral in all these texts. The First Islamic Age c. 650-1050. The Arab conquest and the establishment of the Caliphate resulted in the unification of previously separate political-cultural domains: Sassanid Empire, Byzantine Empire, the broadening of man's geographical horizons, the modification of trade routes, and deep penetration into peoples about who. Nothing had been known until then. It is not surprising then that for the first time we have increasingly accurate information about the Black World, East and West alike. But whereas Egypt and the Maghreb became actually integral parts of the empire, and later of the Islamic community, the Black World was only within the Islamic sphere of influence. Hence we have bits and pieces of information, disjointed, sometimes fabulous, and yet, for all that, valuable. If we accept archival sources, the tradition continuing in Egypt and therefore pertaining specifically to that country, Greek and Coptic papyri from Aphrodite, Arabic papyri from Fayum and Ashmunane to 8, and finally a few 10th century Fatimid items, most of our written sources, whether narrative in the wider sense or indirect, are common to all Africa. This is a conspicuous feature of geographical writings and is visible in many legal texts. Therefore it seems more suitable to inventory our sources from here on by genre, though I shall indicate chronological order and not lose sight of regional structures. Chronicles AWE have no chronicle earlier than the 9th century. In the 8th century oral information was worked into shape, with Egypt as indisputable center save for the east coast of Africa, which had direct commercial links. 27. Referred to by use of Tyre, one of Ptolemy's sources, cf. Y. Fonte, Volume I, 1926, page 73. 28. Here A. Groman is the authority, 1934-59 and 1955. The Greek and Coptic papyri have been studied by H. Bell. For the Fatimid records see Shayal, 1958. IO. Written sources before the 15th century. With southern Iraq, but Egypt, the Maghreb and a fortiori the Sudan were not central to the Islamic world, and the result was that even in the 9th century, when Arabic historiography suddenly began, they received scant attention in the great Tariq's 29 histories Tadari, the Nawari, the Baladhiri of the Anzak al-Ashraf, which focus on the East. Exception must be made for one chronicle which was hardly known until very recently, the Tariq of Caliphate. Kenya. 30. Not only is this book the oldest Arabic annalistic work, Khalifa died in 240 BH, but it has preserved ancient materials overlooked by Tabari. In particular, what it tells us about the conquest of the Maghreb is of the highest importance. Whereas the Medina tradition of the Maghazi left the conquest of Egypt and the Maghreb in the shadow, only the barest essentials are given in Baladhur S. al-Buldan. An Egyptian jurist singled it out for study in a word which is the most important document of the 9th century. The Hefut Misar Wal Maghreb 31 of Ibn al-Hakam, while they resemble a chronicle or Magas work, are really a collection of legal traditions impinging on history. 32b. After a century of silence 850 there appeared a fundamental work which seems not to have been exploited in all its dimensions, the Kitab Wal Misar Wa Kotuha of kind. D. 961. This biographical work, which is not a chronicle but may be treated like one, not only contains accurate first-hand data on Egypt but, because of the early links between that province and the Maghreb, is one of our soundest sources for the 8th century Maghreb. 34. The 10th century is the Ismailian century of Islam, and of African Islam first and foremost. Therefore consult Shiite writings like the Sinach al-Hajjaj, and above all the Khalid Numan s. 29. However, it is important to note that one of the very first Arab historiographers, Umar b. Shagat, has left us the oldest Arab testimony relating to the black peoples, the text of which is reproduced by Tabari, Tariq, Volume VII, pages 609-14. This was the revolt of the Sudan at Medina in 145 BH/762 of our era, which bears witness to the considerable presence of Africans at the height of the period. This text had not been noted or commented on until now. 30. Edited by Umar Najib, 1965 with a preface by A.S. Al-Daily. 31. Edited by Torrey in 1922, partly translated by Gatto, re-edited by Amir at Cairo in 1961. And the caution required in using it, cr. Brunchvigi, 1942-7. Brunchvigi's hypercritical study does not, I think, impair the contribution made by this text, which is capital for Egypt, useful for Africania, and important for the black world. Possible contacts of Utbah with the Fezzan, denied by Brunchvigi in another article, the famous backed treaty with the Nubians. 32. There is not much to be got from a late compiler, Ubayd al-Adi. Salih, discovered and magnified by E. Levi Provençal, 1954, pages 35-42, as a new source for the conquest of the Maghreb. Levi Provençal's evaluation is followed by Mani in his Tableau 1961, page 34, where the analysis of Arabic sources, though close and exhaustive, is not overly concerned with rigorous criticism. 33. Except for a few interesting anonymous chronicles like Al-Iman Wasc Laza, by the pseudo-Ibn Qutayba Cairo, 1904 and the Akbar Majmu' Madrid, 1867. 34. Edited by Argest, 1912, and re-edited at Bayreuth, 1959. 101. TBLE 5.1 Chronological Table of Principal Written Sources. Date before our era. 2065 158800. 500. area code 300200100, Chronicles, Annals. Herodotus 485-25 Demotic Chronicle Polybius 200-120 Diodorus. Narrative sources. Geography, travel, etc. Strabo. Legal, religious works. Book of Kings before 586. Literary texts. Homer. Sallust 87-35 of our era. Pliny the Elder 100. Tacitus Plutarch 200. 300. 622. Pseudo Periplus of Hanno. Ptolemy Periplus of the Erythraean Sea 230. 400500 Procopius 492-562 Cosmas Indicocleus C 535. Vasari. Saint Cyprian 200-58. Saint Augustine 354-436. Muwati. 800 IBNA BD All Hakonku Warism 803-871 before 833. Huk VBLD 897. Mudowasa Ancom as Succuj IHIS. 102. Archival sources. Official records. Private documents. Date. Historical context before our era. Hieratic Papyri Ostraka. Papyri of the Elephantine Jews. 2065 Middle Kingdom 1580 NEW Kingdom. 800 Foundation of Carthage Late Egyptian period 500. 200 The Ptolemies Roman conquest of Africa 146. Noveli of Justinian 100 Romanization of Africa. 200 Apogee of the School of Alexandria. Greek and Coptic papyri. 300 Oxum and the Christianization of Ethiopia area code 333400500 Byzantine reconquest of Africa 533. Aphrodite papyri in Arabic. Fatimid correspondence in Afriqiya. 622 The Hijra Arab expansion Umayyad Caliphate 661-749 800 Bagabid Afriqiya 800-910 Revolt of Bazanjay 868. 103. TBLE 5.1 continued. Date before our era. 900. Chronicles, Annals. Curry. Narrative sources. Geography, travels, etc. Mesaverdell Fluid 947. IBN Honkle Fluid 977. Legal, religious works. JAFNUMEN Shida BU All Arab Sunnite IBN S Sagar Kurajite 1. Literary texts. 1050 Al Rakik D 1028 Al Bakrit Fluid 1068 Maliki. 1100. 1150. 1200. By 300. Anonymous Al Istighfar. IBN Al After Fluid 1234 IBN Al Idhari. Al Mawari IBN ABIs are Al Dahabi IBN called BN. Al Idrizit. Yank VBFL. 1229. IBN Sid before 1286 Abdri Fluid 1289. Al Umri D 1336 IBN Babtati Jani. Cresks, Major Ken Atlas 1375. ABU Zakarian Maximi Al Kabi Al Fadhil Hafsid Manakabes. Ethiopian Monastery Manuscripts. Sephardi. 1400 IBN Tagribri. 1450 Zurara Makrai 104. Archival sources. Official records. Private documents. Arabic papyri of Fahim and Ashkenhain. Date before our era. 900. Historical context. Establishment of the Fatimids in Egypt 969. Fatimid records in Egypt Geniza al-Moravid letters. Murav Ejomi al-Mahid letters. Geniza. 1050. 1150. 1200 Italian documents. The Halali in Afriqiya conquest of Ghana by the Almoravids 1076. Almohads in the Maghreb by Wahhabids in Egypt. Hafsids in Afriqiya Marinids in Morocco. Mamluks in Egypt. Wat records. Al-Kalkashandi. 1300. That was Mali Empire. Mansa Musa 1312-35. 1400. Al-Makrizi 145 degrees. Collapse of Mali and emergence of Songhai. Capture of Ceuta by the Portuguese 1415. Portuguese discovery of Cape Beojador 1434. 105. Methodology and African prehistory. Iftida al-Dawa, a fundamental work which does not give many dates but is full of information about the beginnings of the Fatimid movement. 35 CDHE. First half of the 11th century saw the writing of the famous Kh of Al-Rakik D1028, a fundamental source. The HE work itself is considered as lost, but its main substance was taken up by later compilers like Ibn al-Hari. Not long ago, 1968, a fragment treating of the earliest Khan era, discovered by the Moroccan man Vinai, was published in Tunis, but the attribution to Rakik is not certain. 36 In all these chronicles, Black Africa has next to no place. Moreover, the historian must be severely critical in approaching any of them, must perpetually compare the data in one with data in the others and with data originating elsewhere. Above all, the historian of the Maghreb and Egypt cannot read these chronicles and stop at that. A thorough knowledge of the East is absolutely necessary, and if he is using these sources he must also do some intensive reading in the classic Eastern chronicles. Geographical sources. These are numerous and important from the 9th century. Whatever category they belong to, the cartographical genre of the sphere, all are made famous by Quansamel, more administrative geography, more itinerary sand countries, Basilique, or simply more or less romanticized travels. Arabic geographical writings illustrate a desire to apprehend the oikoumene, the inhabited world, in its entirety. So it is not surprising that Black Africa should be represented in them and that they should be the fundamental sources for our knowledge of it. The exhaustive list compiled by Kerbel and McVeigh, 37, which stops with the 12th century, shows that of the 40 authors who speak of Black Africa, 21 are geographers and that their texts are the richest in material. But no real profit can be derived from them without preliminary critical work. The HE historian of Black Africa must put these Arabic geographical works inside their own cultural context. For example, to what extent does a description correspond to reality, and to what extent does it merely reflect hackneyed themes from the Edda and its various components? 38 What is the share of the Greek heritage, of the Iranian, of the strictly Arabic? HOW much is compilation and HOW much original observation. On the other hand, he must also look at the texts from inside, that is, bring to bear a criticism based on a thorough knowledge of African history. So of course, he must be careful not to read that history solely on the basis of essentially geographical sources. But the point of view, the purely ideological one, of those who refuse to make a close study of these. 35. Published in Tunis and Beirut by M. Dockery. 36. M. Telby flatly denied Rakik's authorship in ISD Tunisia, XIX 1971 pages ICFF, but did not succeed in making out a convincing case. The uncertainty therefore subsists. 37. L. E. Kerbel and V. 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 I 960 and 1965, see also JQAQ, 1975. 38. 8. Mickwell, 1967 and 1977. 106. Written sources before the 15th century. Sources because of Islamophobia. 39 Because of a misplaced concern for an introverted Africanism, is inadmissible. 40 OF the Pleiad of mid-9th to mid-11th century geographers. WHO gave some space to Africa, and nearly all of them did. Only a handful provide original and serious information. IBN Kerdad. VBD 897 Matthew D. Fluid 965 IBN Honkel Fluid 977. 41 All by running VB traveled in Egypt and the Maghreb and left a substantial account of both regions. In his KH and his book 42 he tells us a great deal about the Black World, Ethiopia, the Sudan, Nubia, the Beja, and Zambia. In the Sudan, he mentions the Zagawa of Kanyam and describes their habitat. He describes the Great Kingdom of Ghana and in that connection discusses the problem of gold, just as he treats of the problem of slaves when speaking of the Fezzan. IBN Honkel's Keated Surah All-Out 43 is still more detailed. He visited Nubia and possibly the Western Sudan. His description is especially valuable for the idea it gives of trade relations between the Maghreb and the Sudan. Nearly all the other 10th century geographers provide notes on Black Africa. Ibn al-Fakh has something on Ghana and Kuku, the traveller Butular Ibn Shariar on the east coast and the Zambia. Muhalabi preserved fragments of Aswani in his treatise. Finally, Mass V. S Fields of Gold 965 is dense with information as to the Zambia and the east coast. These texts early attracted the attention of specialists, Africanists and Orientalists, like Delafosse, Shirley, 44 Kramers 45 and MBUNY. For 6. Legal and religious sources LW treatises and hagiographical works of Tabaqat, from Dollars on VNS Mudona to the Kharijite treatises, are a mine of information on the Maghreb. Some of them can be used for the Saharan zone of contact with Black Africa. From Ibn Sagar's Chronicle of the Restimate Imams of 39. In this connection see the highly critical attitude of L. Frodenis, and J. Rauch, 1953, which mostly denounces the ideological distortion in the Sudanese chronicles. 40. It is true that these texts chiefly concern the Sudanese belt and that therefore the unilateral reading of Arabic sources unaided by archaeology may falsify the perspective. But it is untrue that Arabic authors lacked objectivity. And to reproach them for the fragmentary, disorderly character of their writings is to abandon the point of view of the historian of societies for that of the historian of literature. Properly qualified opinions are expressed by N. Levsey, and a similar approach will be found in IHRB's contribution to the 12th International Congress of Historical Studies held in Vienna Acts, pages 31 IFF. See also T. Lewicki, 1971, and 1969. 41. See UNESCO Courier, June 1974. 42. Published by M. J. D. Goge, 1879-94, volume. VII, as are most of the Arab geographers. G. Wheat's translation, Livre de Pays, is useful but not always accurate. 43. Kitab Sur al-Ard, Hibbett, volume. II, L. E. Kerval and V. V. Met V. I 960 and 1965, pages 33 ff 44. E. Shirley, 1931. 45. V. Jafrathia, Encyclopedia de l'Islam, L. Kramers, 1938. 46. The first chapter of his tableau is a systematic inventory of geographical sources.